Good day, everyone. This is Rensilmar Tubog, and now I'm going to discuss utility on the context of psychological testing and assessment. The outline of the Chapter 7 utility would be the definition of utility, factors that affects a test's utility, utility analysis, Taylor-Russell table, the Brogden-Cronbach-Lesser formula, decision theory and test utility, some practical considerations, methods for setting cut scores, and the known group methods, as well as some practical considerations, methods for setting cut scores, IRT-based methods, and other methods. Now, its definition on the context. Utility is defined as the usefulness of practical value of testing to improve efficiency. Note that testing refers to anything from a single test to a large-scale testing program that employs a battery of tests. This is also used to refer to the usefulness of practical value of training program or intervention. We may speak, for example, of the utility of adding a particular concept to an existing corporate training program or clinical intervention. Although, throughout this chapter, our discussion and illustrations will focus primarily on utility as it relates to testing. The next slide talks about the factors that affects a test's utility psychometric soundness. First one we're going to define is the psychometric soundness. It is the reliability and validity of the test, how consistently and accurately a psych test measures what it's supposed to, which it also identifies the concepts of index of reliability, which is how consistently a test measures what it measures, the index of validity, it's defined as to whether a test measures what it purports to measure, and the index of utility is or the practical value of the information derived from scores on the test. In psychometric soundness, the higher the criterion-related validity of test scores for making a particular decision, the higher the utility of test is likely to be, which is, this is in the context of psychometric soundness, wherein this is the general rule that we have to follow. We also have to take note that a valid test does not always mean a useful test. Another factor that affects a test utility other than psychometric soundness would be the costs. Now, if you mention the word cost, what comes to mind? Usually words like money or dollars, while in considerations of test utility, factors variously referred to as economic, financial, or budget-related in nature must certainly be taken into account. In fact, one of the most basic elements in any utility analysis is the financial cost of the selection device or training program or clinical intervention under study. To make it short, cost in the context of test utility refers to disadvantages, losses, or expenses in both economic and non-economic terms. Also, if that testing is to be conducted, then it may be necessary to allocate funds to purchase a particular test, a supply of blank test protocols, and computerized test processing, scoring, and interpretation from the test publisher or some independent service. Associated costs of testing may come in the form of 1. Payment to professional personnel and staff associated with test administration, scoring, and interpretation. 2. Facility rental, mortgage, and or other charges related to the usage of the test facility. And 3. Insurance, legal accounting, licensing, and other routine costs of doing business. However, in some settings, such as private clinics, these costs may be offset by revenue, such as fees paid by test takers. In other settings, such as research organizations, these costs will be paid from the test users' funds, which may be in turn derived from sources such as private donations or government grants. The economic costs listed here are the easy ones to calculate. Not so easy to calculate are other economic costs, particularly those associated with not testing or testing with an instrumental that turns out to be ineffective. As an admittedly far-fetched example, What if skyrocketing fuel costs prompt commercial airline to institute cost-cutting methods? In this example, mention of the variable of loss of confidence brings us to another meaning of cost in terms of utility analysis, that is, cost in terms of loss. Non-economic cost of drastic cost cutting by the airline might come in the form of harm or injury to airline, passengers, and crew as a result of incompetent pilots flying the plane and incompetent ground crews serving the planes. Although people and mostly notable insurance companies do place dollar amount on the loss of life and limb, for our purposes we can still categorize such tragic losses as non-economic in nature. The next factor that affects a test utility would be the benefits. Judgment regarding the utility of a test may take into account whether the benefits of testing justify the costs of administering, scoring, and interpreting the test. So, when evaluating the utility of a particular test, an evaluation is made of the cost incurred by testing as compared to the benefits accrued from testing. Here, in our slide in my discussion, profits is defined as the benefits rather is defined as the profits, gains, or advantages. It's also the economic benefits, which are the financial returns. Hence, in industrial settings, a partial list of such non-economic benefits, many carrying with them economic benefits as well, can be included. One of which would be an increase in the quality of workers' performance, which is a non-economic benefit. The next one is an increase in the quantity of workers' performance, a decrease in the time needed to train workers, a reduction in the number of accidents, and a reduction in worker turnover. All these things that I've mentioned is an example of non-economic benefits that is one of the factors that affects a test utility. Last one of the most economic benefits of a diagnostic test used to make decision about involuntary hospitalization of psychiatric patients is a benefit to society at large. Persons are frequently confined involuntarily for psychiatric reasons if they are harmful to themselves or others. Tools of psychological assessment such as tests, case history data, and interviews may be used to make a decision regarding involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. So through this, we can say that researchers or the ones who are capable of the study are not the only one who could benefit from the test utility. Also, the society at large could have its own benefits towards this for their safety and the time that they're needed to accept the challenges brought up by people with psychiatric illnesses. They can help the society to be more accepting and to be more safe, at least to them and to every people that lives on it. Next slide would be the utility analysis. A utility analysis may be broadly defined as a family of techniques that entail a cost-benefit analysis designed to yield information relevant to a decision about the usefulness and/or practical value of a tool or assessment. Note that in this definition we use the phrase family of techniques. This is so because a utility analysis is not one specific technique used for one specific objective. Rather, utility analysis is an umbrella term covering various possible methods, each requiring various kinds of data to be inputted and yielding various kinds of output. Some utility analyses are quite sophisticated, employing high-level mathematical models and detailed strategies for weighing the different variables under consideration. Other utility analyses are far more straightforward and can be readily understood in terms of answers to relatively uncomplicated questions such as which test gives us more bang for the buck. That is why, if undertaken to evaluate a test, the utility analysis will help make decisions regarding whether one test is preferable to another test for use for a specific purpose. One tool of assessment, such as a test, is preferable to another tool of assessment, such as behavioral observation, for a specific purpose. Third, the addition of one or more tests or other tools of assessment to one or more tests that are already to use is preferable for a specific purpose. 4 is no testing or assessment is preferable to any testing or assessment. If undertaken for the purpose of evaluating a training program or intervention, the utility analysis will help make decisions regarding whether one training program is preferable to another training program. One method of intervention is preferable to another method of intervention. Also, the addition of subtraction of elements to an existing training program improves the overall training program by making it more effective and efficient. The addition or subtraction of elements to an existing method of intervention improves the overall intervention by making it more effective and efficient. No training program is preferable to a given training program, and no intervention is preferable to a given intervention. The endpoint of a utility analysis is typically an educated decision about which of many possible courses of action is optimal. Whether reading about utility analysis in this chapter or in other sources, a solid foundation in the language of this endeavor, both written and graphics, is essential. Toward the end, we hope you find the detailed case illustration presented. The next slide will be talking about how is a utility analysis conducted. The specific objective of a utility analysis will dictate what sort of information will be required as well as the specific methods to be used. Here we will briefly discuss two general approaches to utility analysis. The first is an approach that employs data that should be quite familiar. The first one is the expectancy data. This will provide vital information to decision makers. Also, utilize test data for measuring probability that could provide indication of a likelihood for something to occur. In other words, the test is working as it should, and by instituting this new test on a permanent basis, you could reasonably expect to improve its productivity. You expect something to happen, and when you expect, it will become the likelihood, which is the basis of measuring probability. Next slide will be the utility analysis and illustration. 1. Limit the cost of selection by not using the FERT. This goal could be appropriate if FERT or the Federale Express just needs bodies to fill positions in order to continue operations. If the consequences of hiring unqualified personnel are not a major consideration, and or if the size of the applicant pool is equal to or smaller than the number of openings. Second, we have to ensure that qualified candidates are not rejected. In order to accomplish this goal, set a FERT cut score that ensures that no one who is rejected by the cut would have been deemed qualified at the end of the probationary period. Stated another way, set a cut score that yields the lowest false negative rate. The emphasis in such a scenario is on whittling out of the worst applicants, that is, those applicants who will definitely be deemed unqualified at the end of the probationary period. Third, ensure that all candidates selected will prove to be qualified. To accomplish this goal, set a FERT cut score that ensures that everyone who makes the cut on the FERT is rated as qualified at the end of the probationary period. No one who makes the cut is rated as unqualified at the end of the probationary period. Set a cut score that yields the lowest false positive rate. The emphasis in such a scenario is on selecting only the best applicants, that is, those applicants who will definitely be deemed qualified at the end of probationary period. The last one would be to ensure, to the extent possible, that qualified candidates will be selected and unqualified candidates will be rejected. That's why this objective can be met by setting a cut score on the FERT that is helpful in selecting for permanent positions those drivers who perform satisfactorily on the OTJSR, eliminating from consideration those drivers who perform unsatisfactory. The outcomes of these four options are associated with each definition that they imply. As you can see in figure 1, the next slide, rate data for Federal Express. Before the use of the FERT, any applicant with a valid driver's license and criminal record was hired for a permanent position as an FE driver. On the figure, the consequences of a 50% miss rate was considered. the possibility of an increase in customer complaints regarding the level of service, and also the envision of increase in fault accidents and costly lawsuits. Dr. Carlos is pleasantly distracted from these potential nightmares when she inadvertently leans on her keyboard and it furiously begins to beep. Having rejected option 1, she pressed on the next explores what outcome would be associated with option 2. Dr. Carlos appreciated the false negative rate is zero and thus no potential qualified drivers are turned away based on FERT score. She also believes that a 5% reduction in the miss, which is important, on the illustration that is shown from figure 1 base rate data for Federal Express. And by the way, I forgot to mention Dr. Juan Carlos is the personal director of Federal Express. He's been charged with the task of evaluating the utility of adding a new test to the procedures currently in place for hiring delivery drivers. Current FA policy states that drivers must possess a valid driver's license and have no criminal record. Once hired, the new delivery driver is placed on probation for 3 months, during which time on the job supervisor ratings are collected on random workdays. That's why on selection 2, with low cut score and high selection ratio on figure 2, we can see that the total number of applicants for permanent positions was 60 as evidenced by all of the dots and all of the quadrants. In quadrants A and B, just to the right of the vertical cut score line, are the 57 FE drivers who are offered permanent employment. Using this as basis, Dr. Carlos pauses to envision a situation in which reducing the false negative rate to zero might be prudent. It might be ideal if she were testing drivers for drug use because she would definitely not want a test to indicate a driver is drug-free if that driver had been using drugs. Of course, a test with a false negative rate of zero would likely also have a high false positive ratio. Dr. Carlos says fine and smoothly reaches for her keyboard to select option 3. She used the effort to select with the lowest false positive rate. Now, another graph, close-up figure 3 and another message pop up, which is shown in the figure 3 wherein the selection of with high cut scores and low selection ratio. Lists 100 applicants for every 10 drivers she actually hires to meet her company goal of hiring 60 drivers. Attracting that many applicants to the company is a venture that has some obvious costs. Dr. Carlos sees her recruiting budget dwindle as she repeatedly writes checks for classified advertising in newspapers. In this figure, the selection ratio in this scenario is 6 over 60 or 0.10. We can therefore conclude that 6 applicants, 10% of the 60, who originally applied would have been hired on the basis of their FERT scores with a cut score set on 80. Note also that the base rate improves dramatically from 0.50 without use of the FERT to 1 with a FERT cut score set at 80. This means that all drivers selected when this cut score is in place will be qualified, although only 10% of the drivers will be offered permanent positions. And all who are offered permanent positions will be rated qualified drivers on the OTJSR. Next slide would be the terms and general definition of its terms, what it means in this study and implication in the context of psychological testing and assessment about hits and misses. First one is hit, defined as a correct classification. A passing score on the FERT is associated with satisfactory performance on the OTJSR, and a falling score on the FERT is associated with unsatisfactory performance on the OTJSR. So in its implication, you can read it on the table, which is the predictor test, and the other term to be used would be the miss, defined as an incorrect classification or a mistake. The hit rate, the proportion of people that an assessment tool accurately identifies as possessing or exhibiting a particular trait, ability, behavior, or attribute. The miss rate, or the proportion of people that an assessment tool inaccurately identifies as possessing or exhibiting a particular trait, ability, or behavior, or attribute. The false positive, a specific type of miss whereby an assessment tool falsely indicates that the test taker possesses or exhibits a particular trait, ability, behavior, or attribute. The false negative, a specific type of miss whereby an assessment tool falsely indicates that the test taker does not possess or exhibit a particular trait, ability, behavior, or attribute. So as you can see from the table, you can read what it means in the study and all its implications accordingly. So please take time to read. The next slide would be the most everything you ever wanted to know about utility tables. So I'm gonna enumerate the instrument, which is first one from the table is the expectancy table or chart. The next one will be the Taylor-Russell tables, and the third one will be the Naylor-Sign tables, which will be discussed furthermore on the slides. On the following next slides, or the following column rather. So expectancy table or chart, it tells us about the likelihood that individuals who score within a given range on the predictor will perform successfully on the criterion, while the Taylor-Russell tables tells us the increase in base rate of successful performance that is associated with a particular level of criterion-related validity. While the Naylor-Sign tables tells us that the likely average in increase in criterion performance as a result of using a particular test or intervention also provides selection ratio needed to achieve a particular increase in criterion performance. An example of the expectancy table or chart would be when a school psychologist uses an expectancy table to determine the likelihood of students who score within a particular range on an aptitude test will succeed in regular classes as opposed to special education classes. Advantage would be easy to use graphical display. Disadvantages, one of its disadvantages would be it dichotomizes performance into successful and unsuccessful categories. While on Taylor-Russell tables, an example would be a human resources manager store uses the Taylor-Russell tables to decide whether applicants' positions should be administered an extra venture inventory prior to hire. Through this, the manager can estimate whether the increase in proportion of the sales force that do successfully meet their quota will justify the cost of testing all sales applicants. It's advantageous since this instrument is easy to use and shows the relationship between selection ratio, criterion relatability, and existing base rate, while it's also disadvantageous since the relationship between predictor and criterion must be linear, so it does not indicate the likely average in increase in performance with use of the test. Next was the example of the Naylor-Sign tables, which is the provost at a private college estimates the increase in applicant pool that is needed in order to improve the mean performance of students. It selects by 0.50 standardized units while still maintaining its enrollment figures. This kind of instrument would be advantageous to the fact that it provides information needed to use the Brogden-Cronbach-Lesser utility formula. Also, it does not dichotomize criterion performance, and it is useful either for showing average performance gain or to show selection ratio needed for a particular performance gain. It is, however, disadvantageous since it overestimates utility unless top-down selection is used, and utility expressed in terms of performance gain based on standardized units, which can be difficult to interpret in practical terms, so it does not address monetary issues such as cost of testing or return on investment. Next slide would be the Brogden-Cronbach-Lesser formula. So it has been immortalized in the Brogden-Cronbach-Lesser formula used to calculate the dollar amount of a utility gain resulting from the use of a particular selection instrument under specified conditions. So, as you can see in the formula, in the first part of the formula, N represents the number of applicants selected per year, T represents the average length of time in the position or tenure, R subscript XY represents the criterion-related validity coefficient for the given predictor and criterion, capital S and D subscript Y represents the standard deviation of performance in dollars of employees, and Z subscript M represents the mean or the standardized score of the test for selected applicants. The second part of the formula represents the cost of testing, which takes into consideration the number of applicants, which is N, multiplied by the cost of the test for each applicant, which is C. Its application, the PAGCG formula can be applied to a question raised in chapters close up about the utility of the FERT. That's why in using this, we will arrive at the next slide, which is the productivity gain, That refers to an estimated increase in work output. In this modification of the formula, the value of the standard deviation of productivity as d subscript p is substituted for the value of the standard deviation of performance in dollars as d subscript y. The result is a formula that helps estimate the percent increase in output expected through the use of a particular test. The revised formula is productivity gain equals n times t times r subscript xy times sd subscript p times z subscript m minus n times c. So this results to a formula that helps estimate the percent increase in output expected through the use of a particular test. Next slide would be the decision theory and test utility. So decision theory provides guidelines for setting optimal cutoff scores. In setting such scores, the relative seriousness of making false positive or false negative selection decision is frequently taken into account. The idea of applying statistical decision theory to questions of test utility was conceptually appealing and promising, and an authoritative textbook of the day reflects the great enthusiasm in which this marriage of enterprises was greeted. Which is why the conjunction of utility theory and decision theory involves formulation of decisions making in which the criteria for choice among competing alternatives are based on numerical representation of the decision on basis preference and values. Although it is a child of decision theory, utility theory has emerged as a subject in its own right, which is why employers are reluctant to use decision theory based strategies in their hiring practices because of the complexity of their application and the threat of legal challenges. Thus, although decision theory approaches assessment hold great promise, this promise has yet to be fulfilled, so it is useful in utility. Decision theory paves way to making strategies that could help them hire countless employees for their company to continue working. Which is why on the next slide there are some practical considerations that needs to be considered, because a number of practical matters must be considered when conducting utility analysis. The first one would be the pool of job applicants. This is important to be considered since if you were to read a number of articles in the utility analysis literature on personal selection, you might come to the conclusion that there exists out there what seems to be a limited supply of potential employees just waiting to be evaluated and possibly selected for employment. Also is the complexity of a job, because in general the same sorts of approaches to utility analysis are put to work for positions that vary greatly in terms of complexity. This is why the same sorts of data are gathered, the same sort of analytic methods may be applied, and the same sorts of utility models may be invoked for corporate positions ranging from assembly line worker to computer programmer. Which leads us to arrive in the cut score in use, also called a cutoff score, that we have previously defined as a reference point derived as a result of a judgment and used to divide a set of data into two or more classifications. Through this, with some action to be taken or some inference to be made on the basis of these qualifications, relative cut score may be defined as a reference point in the distribution of test scores used to describe a set of data into two or more classifications that is set based on norm-related considerations rather than on the relationship of test scores to a criterion. That's why, because this type of cut score is set with reference to the performance of a group or some targeted segment of a group, it is also referred to as a norm reference cut score. In contrast to a relative cut score is the fixed cut score, which we may define as a reference point in a distribution of test scores used to divide a set of data into two or more classifications that is typically set with reference to a judgment concerning a minimum level of proficiency required to be included in a particular classifications. A distinction can also be made between the terms multiple cut scores and multiple hurdles as used in decision-making process. Multiple cut scores refers to the use of two or more cut scores with preference to one predictor for the purpose of categorizing test takers. So for example, your instructor may have multiple cut scores in place every time an examination is administered, and each class member will be assigned to one category on the basis of scores on that examination. That is, meeting or exceeding one CAT score will result in an A for the examination, meeting or exceeding another CAT score will result in B for the experimentation, and so forth. Of course, we may also speak of multiple CAT scores being used in an evaluation that entails several predictors wherein applicants must meet the requisite CAT score on every predictor to be considered for the position. At the various stage in a multi-stage or multiple hurdle selection process, a CAT score is in place for each predictor used. The CAT score used for each predictor will be designed to ensure that each applicant possesses some minimum level of a specific attribute or skill. In this context, multiple hurdles may be thought of as one collective element of a multi-stage decision-making process in which the achievement of a particular CAT score on one test is necessary in order to advance to the next stage of evaluation in the selection process. Because of that, an assumption is made that high scores on one attribute can in fact balance out or compensate for low scores on another attribute. This is called compensatory model of selection. Excuse me. According to this model, a person strong in some areas and weak in other can perform as successfully in a position as a person with moderate abilities in all areas relevant to the position in question. When a compensatory selection model is in place, the individual or entity making the selection will, in general, differently weight the predictors being used in order to arrive at a total score. Such different weight may reflect value judgments made on the part of the test developers regarding the relative importance of different criteria used in hiring. That's why in the next consecutive slides, we're going to talk about the methods for setting CAT scores. The first one will be the Angoff method, devised by William Angoff, year 1971. The Angoff method used for setting fixed CAT scores can be applied to personal selection tasks as well as to question regarding the presence or absence of a particular trait, attribute, or ability. This is used for the purpose of personal selection expert in the area that can provide estimates regarding how test takers have at least minimal competence for the position should answer the test items correctly. As for the application for purposes relating to the determination of whether or not test takers possess a particular trait, attribute, or ability, an expert panel makes judgments concerning the way a person with that trait, attribute, or ability would respond to test items. In both cases, the judgments of the experts are averaged to yield CAT scores for the test. The next one would be the known group methods, also referred to as method of contrasting groups. The known group methods entails collection of data on predictor of interest from groups known to possess and not to possess a trait or ability attribute of interest. Based on an analysis of this data, a CAT score is set on the test that best discriminates the two groups' test performance. That is why the main problem with using known groups is the determination of where to set the cutoff score is inherently affected by the composition of the contrasting group. No standard set of guidelines exists for choosing contrasting groups, which led us to the other method which is known as the IRT-based method in the next slide. The method that described thus far for setting CAT scores are based on a classical test score theory. In this theory, CAT scores are typically set based on test takers' performance across all the items on the test. Some portion of the total number of items on the test must be scored correct or in a way that indicates the test taker possesses the target trait or attribute in order for the test taker to pass the test. Within the item response theory or the IRT framework, however, things can be done a little differently. In the item response framework, each item is associated with a particular level of difficulty. In order to pass the test taker must answer items that are deemed to be above some minimum level of difficulty, which is determined by experts and serves as the CAT score. IRT method could make use of the item mapping method, or it is a technique that has found application in setting CAT scores for licensing examinations. It entails the arrangement of items in a histogram with each column in the histogram containing items deemed to be of equivalent value. Also, there is a thing called bookmark method. It's an IRT based method of setting cut scores that is more typically used in academic applications. The use of this method begins with the training of expert with regards to minimal knowledge, skills, and or abilities that test takers should possess in order to pass. Subsequent to this training, the experts are given a book of items with one item printed per page such that items are arranged in an ascending order of difficulty. The last one would be other methods. First would be the method of predictive yield or the technique for setting cut scores which took into account the number of positions to be filled, projections regarding the likelihood of offer, acceptance, and the distribution of applicant score. Another approach to setting cut scores employs a family of statistical technique that is also they call discriminant analysis, also referred to as discriminant function analysis. These techniques are typically used to shed light on the relationship between identified variables, such as scores, battery of tests, and two, in some cases, naturally occurring groups, such as persons judged to be successful at a job and a persons judged unsuccessful at a job. All in all, in this chapter, we have focused on the possible benefits of testing and how to assess those benefits. In so, we have touched on several aspects of test development and construction. That's why in the next chapter, we're going to delve more deeply into the details of these important elements of testing and assessment. So, everything I've said will be further discussed in the next chapter, next reporter, and that ends my discussion. The reference that I use will be the Psychological Testing and Assessment, an Introduction to Test and Measurement, 9th edition by Ronald J. Cohen and Mark E. Swardick. If you want to know more about what we're talking about in this part of the presentation, you can read the book that I use as a reference, or you can find other references as to every topic that we have discussed. Thank you for listening. Bye.